Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We have three very talented award-winning authors with us this afternoon, helping us to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Zoom into Books. We started this April 1st with our first broadcast, and since that time we've done about 200 Zoom into Books. So we're here to celebrate, to bring you our best-selling authors, our new books, forthcoming books. And we're going to get started today with Karl Stewart. He writes Westerns and memoirs, and he also has a children's book. We have Kevin Miller with us, who has written 2 books based on his family history. He has a new book out this year, and Richard Hatin, who writes good versus evil and a little bit of horror thrown in there and mystery. He also has a young adult book. So you're going to get a chance to meet each one of these award-winning authors today. So Karl, I'd like for you to start, and please tell us a little bit about yourself and the inspiration for your book.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for having me on Headline Books. Yes, I came by writing indirectly. I always loved to write, but I didn't actually start trying to work at the craft until I'd gone through a couple other transformations, you might say. I started off, my first job was a soldier. I was a Special Forces sergeant in the 1960s, communications. Well, that had a short lifespan, as did the 60s. And then from there, I went into teaching. I taught social studies and English. And one reason I decided to become a teacher was because I believed at the time, being naive, that teachers had their summers off, and that would give me time to write. I could work on the craft during the year as a teacher, and then summers, I could sit and just work on it. Well, that never happened, because if you know anything about education, it's a 12-month job, period. And I managed, after a couple decades of that, of taking an early leave and delving into what I really wanted to do since I was about 6 years old, and that was write. And Kathy and Headline Books picked me up and have been encouraging me ever since. So that's roughly where I came from. Where I am is this: when I started to write, why did I choose what I did? A Western. It's not exactly the big blockbuster sort of thing that we look at when we're writing. You can go to any bookstore that still exists and find a rather short shelf of Westerns. But I loved Westerns. I grew up with Westerns. When I was a child, TV was all Westerns. If there wasn't Gunsmoke or Paladin or something else, there was always a good Western on, it seemed. And I read Westerns. Zane Grey, Luke Short, Mac Brand, Louis L'Amour. Those were men who taught me how to judge a Western. So I thought, I'm going to give that a try. And then where would I go for a source of inspiration? And that was where it really came down to. I was talking to my dad one day, and he said, well, why don't you go with Seabird? I said, Dad, Seabird died when I was still young. Seabird is my great-grandfather. He was a Choctaw Indian born in Oklahoma and drifted down into Texas in the late 1800s. He became a cowboy, a rodeo star, a cattle driver. He was a legend in our family, you might say. But I thought, I don't know much about him. But Dad said, well, I can tell you. So Dad and I sat down, did a series of interviews, and the more we talked, the more I remembered things about this man. He became my inspiration, the anchor, the North Star, the lodestone of my writing, Seabird. And that's why in the first three books, this was the first book, the title, The Legend of Seabird, The Last Long Drive, which was a cattle drive up the Chisholm Trail. The follow-up to that was Devil's Backbone. Once again, The Legend of Seabird up there. And the third one, which just came out this year, was a little hiatus, was The Legend of Seabird Kimichi. He's in all of them. He was my man when I was a little boy. He was the man. I used to hang out in his workshop, and he'd make things. He could make anything. To this day, the gifts, I have two gifts that I treasure more than anything else, are two pairs of chaps that he made for me and gave to me on my 4th birthday. I wore the first pair out till I wore the knees out. I'd put them on. I wouldn't get up in the morning without putting those chaps on. And didn't matter what, I was going to church, I'd put those chaps on till I wore the knees out, and Mom threw them away. And I dug them out of the trash and said, you can't throw them out. Granddad made them for me. I've still got those and a pair he made at the same time for me when I grow up. Show chaps, as he made them for himself when he worked in the rodeo, riding broncs, bulls, and doing rope tricks. He was a master. I still remember him doing rope tricks when he was in his 80s. So Seabird was the man. Now, to differentiate him from my fictional character, it came to his name. It is spelled S-E-E-B-I-R-D, Seabird, but if you asked him his initials, he'd say S-B. But if you spelled his name, it's all one word, S-E-E-B-I-R-D, one name. So I decided to differentiate him. I separated him into two words, Seabird. That's the difference. I have loved going through the memoirs of the family about him. And the more I found out about him, the more I wanted to write. So I use him, I place him in historical fiction. Those are the Seabird set, those 3 Westerns of this Choctaw. He could make anything, Dad said. So I gave him magic hands. That's my only, I say, oddity in the novels. He has a little special gift. The 4th book I wrote, The 7th Cruise, is a novel of World War II. That's based largely on the career, on the experiences of my father, who was a sailor in World War II, sailed on that ship right back there, the Hancock, and other World War II veterans that I interviewed. That book has done well. It won an award at the London Book Festival. After that, a couple of books I wrote are based on my life growing up. Up Harvey's Creek and Fare Thee Well, Harvey's Creek, both set in West Virginia, rural West Virginia, where I was born and raised. The problem and the connection with all of these in Seabird is he is in everything, if not physically, as a mentor, as a guide. In the first 3 books, the 3 Westerns, he was the central figure, the protagonist. In the 7th Cruise, he was the grandfather who helped raise my father, who became the sailor. And in the last 2, the Harvey's Creek's books, Seabird was an old man and he passed away, but still had influence in those books. I loved him. My father's problem was that he was torn up by PTSD in World War II. His ship was kamikaze, he was injured, his life was not a pleasant one. It sort of spiraled downhill after the war, which became very difficult in our family. Year by year, it was worse, not better. My mother, after 14 years, couldn't take it any longer, and that's also hinted at with this conflict between those 2 in the Harvey's Creek's books. He lost his family, lost his wife, lost his house, lost his job, but most of all, he lost his self-respect. And it took him most of the rest of his life to put that all back together again. Because of that, and because of the impact of what that has meant When I became a soldier, my father and I just broke completely, no connections. And when I was writing and I was starting to do work on the 7th Cruise, I interviewed him. And he started, for the first time, he's in his 80s then, opening up, telling me some things that I could relate to because I'd come out of Special Forces in the 60s. And all of a sudden, things that made zero sense when I was a kid made sense. I couldn't be sympathetic with him, but I was empathetic. I knew what he was talking about. I knew what he went through. And because of that, now I do a lot of talks. I do a lot of talks on PTSD, on coping with PTSD, and how writing for me has been almost therapy. It has helped me deal with mine. So I do one talk on healing through storytelling. And I've talked to Navy clubs, veterans organizations. The response has been wonderful. We can connect. We know what we're talking about. And we found out that if I can tell them, encourage them to write their experiences, even if they fictionalize them. Doesn't have to be a novel. Could be just a letter to yourself. Could be a memoir, could be a poem, could be a song, whatever, that they start feeling those knots that they're carrying inside that are tied up, loosening up. I did. And it probably doesn't work for everybody. There's no silver bullet that I've ever found, but it can be very useful in helping to live a life. As one veteran told me not long ago, well, it was a year ago now, before COVID hit, he said, at least it doesn't control my life anymore. And that, it makes a huge difference. For that, I'm very happy. But if I hadn't gotten into the writing and started writing Westerns, and I would never have gotten to the 7th Cruise, and I would never have gotten to Harvey's Creek, I probably wouldn't have addressed these issues myself. But now that's where I go. And right now I'm currently working on a book that should be ready this fall based on a fictionalized version of my experiences in Special Forces back in the 1960s. We'll see if I can ever decide, gut it up enough to get that into, see if it's worth publishing. But we'll see how she goes. That's what I do. That's what I write, I work, I talk, I speak to groups. And thanks to Kathy, I'm still in it.
Thank you, Karl. You've also had a varied career. Thank you for your service too. And writing is the best therapy for a lot of people. We get some excellent books coming from personal experience and adversity. Kevin Miller, I'd like for you to tell people about yourself and about your books, please.
Absolutely, sure. My background is, I'm a U.S. vet. I spent 8 years in the United States Air Force in a communications squadron. I've earned a couple degrees, one in electronics technology, one in information technology, and I've been a technical writer, and I never had planned to become an author until a few years back when we learned a pretty dark family secret. I learned that my last name really isn't Miller, which was a shock because my father didn't even know this. My last name is actually a Polish name, Puchalski. And the way we found this out is an uncle of mine had received some newspaper articles that were from 1920, and they kind of detail a murder, a scandalous murder in our family. My great-grandfather was murdered in his sleep on his farm in a small township called Southington in Ohio. So, this came as a huge shock to the family because we had no idea this happened. My grandfather took this secret to his grave and never told anybody. Him and his siblings swore to secrecy, but it finally came out a few years ago. And it inspired me to decide to want to write a book about it. And actually my dad wanted to write the book and he just didn't know how. And he just came to me and said, would you write this? And having never written a book before, I said, I would love to take that on. So I did. It took about 3 years to write, doing the research, going through newspaper articles, legal documents, all, letters from family, just to try to piece the story together, to put it together. And the book is called Heart of Steel, based on a true story. It is, it's available on Amazon on my website. It won a bronze award at the Reader's Favorite 2020 for best general fiction historical drama. But it was a real exercise in learning how to write, because I not only did all the research on this story, I had to kind of learn how to write too, you know, to become an author. And as my other two partners here know, there's a lot of work in becoming an author and learning how to write. So that's what got me into writing. That's what got me into authorship, was that story. And I was proud to be able to hand a copy of that book once it was published to my father. I autographed and hand him a published version of that. So that made me happy. The book has been optioned by GKG Productions here in Hollywood to become a feature film. So we're currently working on that. We're working on getting that pitched to studios and investors to turn that into a movie. A screenplay's already been written for it. So that's kind of that. So that's how kind of got me started as an author. Now my second book is inspired by my great-great-grandmother, who was of the Haudenosaunee, more commonly known as the Iroquois nation. She was what they refer to as Mingo, which was Ohio Seneca. I think they're half Seneca, half Cayuga, Native American. So she's the protagonist of the story, and its setting is in the Civil War era. And it's a story about her and my great-great-grandfather, who was Irish, and he was a Union soldier. Here's the book right here, White Skies, Black Mingo. And those are my daughters on there. My daughters are actors and models, and they actually volunteered to, I had to pay them actually, I didn't really volunteer, to be models on the front cover. So, and you can see here, I'm proud of this. I received a gold medal for the Mom's Choice Awards recently, a couple months ago. So I was really happy with that. Give me some validation. But that story, I think I was inspired by the love of a Native American woman and an Irish, son of Irish immigrants in the Civil War during a time. I mean, it's just up to recent years, interracial marriages were frowned upon. And in that time, it was illegal for them to even get married. So just seeing that and being in an interracial marriage myself and relating to that inspired me to write. I said, this needs a story, around it. So the story's historical fiction, but it's just inspired by their love. And it's a story of a young Native American girl's courage and her perseverance and her struggles. The story begins where they're escaping. She's escaping with her mother and her shaman grandmother, a smallpox epidemic. And they're on the road fleeing, and they're trying to make their way to Wheeling, Virginia at the time, because it wasn't West Virginia yet. And so there's a lot that happens to her on the way, a lot of tragedy, and she finds herself, facing a severe winter storm on her own, and with only the companionship of her two wolf pets that are along on the journey. So that's kind of where I got started with that. Now the second book, White Skies, Black Mingo, I wrote in about 3 months because we're on low COVID lockdown. Because I kind of, I got better at writing, obviously, by the first experience. So the second book was easier to write. Not that it was easy to write, but it was easier to write. And it took me less time, about 3 months, because I was just hammering it out because I had nothing else to do. I couldn't go outside, couldn't go anywhere. So we got through that. And it's done very well. And I'm going to throw a shout out to my wife, who's my critique partner and reads my books as I go along, and she hammers me for stuff that she doesn't like, and we go back and forth a little bit, but she's been so helpful to me in my writing and given me perspective on stories and point of view of women. Now, Black Skies, White Mingo is told through the eyes of a 12-year-old. She starts out as a 12-year-old female Native American. So that took a lot of insight, and the fact I think I have 7 daughters helps me to understand women a little bit. And of course I have my wife, my critique partner, there helping me out. And I really feel that from the feedback that I really accomplished, something there. I got a very nice review by a good friend of mine who's become a good friend of mine, and I know Kathy knows her very well, Dream of Denver. She just recently put up a review of my book, and I won't read the whole thing, but the last part of is that she says, I can't recommend this book highly enough. The fact that our author, Kevin Miller, writes from a woman's point of view with such honesty, such clarity, is proof positive that he has strong, capable women in his life and pays attention to them. Otherwise, how could he capture the female essence so beautifully and translate it into the pages of his book? My best advice is do yourself a favor and don't miss White Skies, Black Mango. And thank you so much, Dreama, for that. She loved the book, and she made a comment that if she didn't know it was written by a man, she would never have guessed it wasn't written by a woman, which was a huge compliment for me. And it kind of validated that I was able to do that with the help of my wife too, because she pointed some things out to help me along there. So that's the inspiration of my books. And that's how I got started in writing, and I'm working on a third book now. It's titled The Promise of Lazarus, and I'm kind of switching out just a little bit from my historical fiction and historical drama, and wanted to try my hand at a little bit of science fiction in my style still, but just to try to be outside the box a little bit and see how it goes. And I'm having fun with this story, and it's currently coming back from my editor, so it should be out pretty soon, and I can talk more about that later. So, so that's a lot about me. I think I'll just pass the torch over there to Dick.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That's terrific. It's interesting that you and Karl both have Native American ancestry.
Yes, yes.
And that has come through your books. And as Dreama said, Kevin did manage to get the female point of view, which is not an easy thing to do at all.
Not easy.
That's right. That's right. So, Dick, we're going to put you up here. Dick has varied books from horror to spiritual to young adult. So Dick, would you please tell us something about yourself and the inspiration for your books?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you in a larger way, because all of the authors today and the many other authors who come to work with your company, we are richly rewarded for your talent that you help make us better in the marketplace. So thank you so much for that. And I can tell you that you've also kept me on the straight and narrow, because we've had many conversations about book titles, and you were always right. And I was not. So far, the record isn't so good from my end, but I thank you again for that as well. Let me just back up by saying that my entire life started with a working career in local government. Spent 4 years working in local government after graduating from college, and then I went on to work for state government, and eventually ended up with the federal government for 37 years. And that's where all of the horror fiction comes from, but not my times in government, just the things that you see and you do in your life. Because as a writer, you're really pulling little strings out of what you encounter in your living that allows you to weave a fabric and weave a tale that hopefully can entertain, enlighten, or inspire. So for me, I always have my eye open for those kinds of things. And one thing that was always on my mind is I had an experience once. My wife and I were hiking in the woods in Vermont, trying to reach the summit of one of the taller mountains in the state. And we came across, after a densely undergrowth area, we came across an area that was cleared out, and there was a cemetery there. And when we read the inscription on the cemetery, there were 13 or 14 headstones. And according to the inscription, it was the headstones represented one family, and they all died on the same day in the 1860s. So we were puzzled by that thing. And we checked with local officials, and they were telling us they had no idea there was a cemetery there, and they had no birth, death, or marriage records in connection with that particular name in that family. So that mystery has always been in the back of my mind. And I thought one day that would turn into an interesting book. And lo and behold, in 1988, Stephen King, my hero, came to New Hampshire to campaign on behalf of Senator Gary Hart, who was running for president. And it was a heavy snow day. We were getting about a foot of snow that day. And I was told that Stephen King was having lunch at a restaurant not far from where I work. So I immediately grabbed my coat, told my boss I'm going to be gone for a while. I ran out the door. I had to meet my hero. And when I walked into the restaurant, he was sitting way in the back all by himself. And I went over to his table, and my glasses were all steamed up, of course, so I had to remove them. I couldn't really even see him that well. And he looked up at me, and I'm sure he was shocked that someone would approach him like that, but I did. And I told him I was fascinated with his writing. I've read everything he had put out at that point. And he said, "Would you care to join me?" I was just floored. So I said, "Of course." So I sat down, and he was finishing his meal, and we started to talk. And we talked about the Boston Red Sox. We talked about football, Boston Celtics, Boston Bruins. He's a big sports fan. Then we ended up migrating into talking about television, old time television, the old original Twilight Zone shows and Outer Limits and some of the others. And then we talked about murder mystery magazines that he enjoyed as a kid, and so did I. And as those conversations were rolling along, I finally thought, well, I'm going to tell him about this mysterious cemetery. He's the perfect guy to tell the story. And so I pitched the idea to him, and he sat back and listened. And when I was done, there was a pause. And then he leaned into the table, and he looked at me, and he pointed at me, and he said, "You should write the story." I said, "Well, wait, I'm a federal bureaucrat. I know federal regulations and contracts. I don't know anything about fiction." He said, "No," but he says, "You've got an important quality. You're a good storyteller. And that's an ingredient that you have to have if you ever want to be a good writer." Well, after hearing that, I thought he was just being gentle and pushing me off. And he continued and offered me some advice of what to do and what not to do as a writer if I wanted to ever become one. So I walked out of there, quite frankly, having my ego, in my opinion, deflated. But about 3 or 4 years after that, I started dabbling with a computer for the first time. We had such a thing in my house, and I had never taken typing lessons. So I sat down to learn how to type, self-taught, and I started working on that idea and trying to put it on paper, and at the same time get myself acclimated to this new machine. And my wife started to read it, and then she shared some of the material with friends and neighbors, and pretty soon everybody kept saying, "Where's the rest of the story? Where's the rest of the story?" I had no idea where I was going to go with that darn story. Well, to cut to the chase, it turned into a book, which I submitted to you. And after some back and forth on it, because it needed a lot of work, you finally told me it was ready to go. And that book was Evil Agreement. You can hopefully see it here. And by the way, that cemetery is my backyard here in the house. So anyways, I wrote this book, and it got very well received. And I think it lives up to the standards of Stephen King's stories. It has a lot of twists and turns and a very powerful ending. But then I realized I couldn't stop with one book. So I had other books I had been working on. And lo and behold comes Deadly Whispers, which interestingly enough is interwoven with a story about the Abenaki Indian tribe, speaking of Native Americans. Because as it turns out, in my ancestral past, the Abenakis were part of our family history. And so I wove Abenaki legend, but I made it because of the source of the story. We pulled upon some legendary myths that were promulgated through the Iroquois history and the Huron history, and I just appropriated them and made them Abenaki for the purposes of the story. But this was also very interesting because the real background and inspiration for this was the experiences of one day going to explore a cave in Vermont with some classmates of mine. And we were exploring the far deepest end of the cave, and out of the darkness, we heard this horrible sound racing towards us. And we were terrified. So we hid to the sides of the cave, and this creature came flying by us. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but it was certainly powerful enough of a memory that I turned that into a book. The next book that I jumped into, a real sea changer, is Miracle at Janet's Mountain. This book came to me by way of a dream. Yeah, something like that can cause a book. I was in the middle of this dream about this story about a disabled person becoming a messenger for God. And when I woke up from the dream, I had to grab a piece of paper near the nightstand. I wrote down the idea, but I couldn't go back to sleep. So I snuck out of the bedroom, started working on this book, and 6 weeks later, this book was done. And it received an award in Europe, and in Los Angeles, it was recognized as well. But it is a powerful book because it honors and celebrates the talents of people who are disabled. And I even had, at one book signing event, I had a lady approach me, and she was in tears when she approached me, and I didn't know what I might have done to offend her, but she said, I have to come here and see you. Somebody told me you were at this Made in New Hampshire Expo. I came to thank you for giving me back my daughter. She said, my daughter was developmentally challenged just like the main character in your book, and I lost her 2 years ago to cancer. But as I read your book, what I got from that is the absolute respect and the love you seem to have for people who are disabled and the way you portrayed her. It felt like she was sitting beside me as I turned every page of your book. And for that, I am deeply grateful. I wanted my wife to meet this lady, so I turned around to get my wife's attention, and when I looked back, the lady had disappeared into the crowd. It was one of those profound moments as a writer where the feedback you get for people who are reading it really impress upon you the power of your words and the power of whatever you've conceived in your mind. So I'm even more careful when I write today because of that. The next book that came up was Kill List. This was inspired by a story I read in a newspaper. And the story was how cold case detectives are struggling to solve some crimes in New Hampshire. So I kept digging into this and looked at the cold case units in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And they're all having the same challenges, but they collaborated with each other, and they're having a little bit of progress, but only about 1% of their cold cases will ever be solved. That's a tremendous responsibility, and yet they are not deterred. They will keep digging and digging and digging. So I really wrote this story as a way of honoring their efforts. And this is a story that does have a culmination with the capture of someone who was a serial killer, and it solves a lot of cold cases. And I even in the back of the book mentioned that if anybody has any information about cold cases, please contact your local state police office or your local police force and help them in this endeavor. And the next book I'll show you, which will be the last one I'll mention at this juncture, is called Next in Line. It's the first book of a trilogy series that I've written. It involves 7 teenagers who are being raised in different parts of the world, and they're suddenly swept up from their families and taken to a secret location where it's disclosed to them their moms and dads weren't really their moms and dads. They were caretakers, because the 7 teenagers are the direct linear descendants of the Knights Templar, the last ones on Earth, the last ones alive. And they are being called to war to go against a battle against the forces of evil. So it's a story to hopefully inspire young adult readers. And I should mention, though, that the mentor that these young teenagers have in this task happens to be the world's oldest dragon. He's almost 3,000 years old, and he does not really have a lot of patience around teenagers. Anyways, those are my working books for the moment. I have others that are in line. I've got the second installment to that book, the third installment I'm working on. I have another book that's already done and ready to roll out. And then I've got a fourth book that I'm working on, and I really, really got to get it done because it talks to me every day in my head. I keep hearing the story, and the story is not letting go. And if I want some relief, I've got to get that one too. I got to get that out the door. So that's my backstory to my books. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. You have such a wide range from young adult to, and I really don't publish horror. When Dick sent me his first book, I told him that. And as I talked to Dick and I read his first 3 chapters, it's really not horror, it's good versus evil in the best way possible. And all 3 of these gentlemen write page-turning books. You can't go wrong with them. And I know we've had a few people join us late on Facebook. Today we're talking with award-winning authors Richard Hatin, Kevin Miller, and Karl Stewart. Their books are available on their websites, and I've put the links in the Facebook feed. And they're available on Amazon.com and also on headlinebooks.com. So I put together some photos that I'd like for you all to talk about. These are some of your author experiences and places that you've been. All of our authors speak, they do workshops, and once we can do in-person events, we'll get back on the road across the United States and bring our authors hopefully to a city close to where you are living. Karl, I think these are some of your events. If you'd like to give us a brief description.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. Yes, if I can identify them all. The one on the left, with me standing by those cases, was a display of my books and some artifacts that I've used. I write historical fiction, so they're often based on some element of reality, of the real thing. That's why someone once said that historical fiction is a matter of writing the history so exciting that people can't believe it's true, and then writing the fiction so believable that people can't believe it's not. And that was at a public library where I'd given a talk on my travels in Africa, as a matter of fact, of which is another project I'm working on for a book. The middle one up there is right down in Charlotte. That's the Charlotte Christmas show. You can tell by the Christmas decorations there, so lovingly done. I think mostly that's done by you and by your daughter, but it's a wonderful time. Anybody in the area, I would really encourage to go down there. It's a great experience to meet and talk with people. That's something I try to do. Next to it over there on the right, that looks like that was perhaps at Charleston, because
I think that's in New Orleans.
that may have been, yes, that was New Orleans. After I wrote Up Harvey's Creek, which won an award down there, I was down there. That was down in New Orleans. That's right.
Yeah.
And the last picture at the bottom, that I believe is in Charleston.
Yes,
That's the West Virginia Writers thing. And if I look like I'm enjoying myself in all of those, that's because I really am. I enjoy those things, the chance to get out and talk with people and to listen, because I've gotten ideas, not for whole books, but I have definitely used ideas I've gotten from people. We call it researching. Other people call it eavesdropping, snooping, things like that, but writers call it research. These pictures here, these 3 pictures, the one on the left was a poster that was done for a talk I did on post-traumatic stress disorder, healing through storytelling. And I talk about the issue of PTSD, which is not necessarily, by the way, a military thing. PTSD can come from childbirth. It can come from a car accident. It can come from childhood trauma. PTSD is occurring often with military, but it's not. But I had some issues I had to deal with when I got out. That's a picture of me standing there, coming home, as a matter of fact. The picture in the middle so I do talks. The picture in the middle of the bottom is me standing next to a good friend of mine. His name is Tough. And I learned much of what I wrote about in my Westerns. For example, Kiamichi, which was the name of my great-grandfather's first horse. It's also the name of a river he grew up near. But much of the detail I learned about horses I learned firsthand from a friend who taught me. And the third picture over there is me standing next to someone who came by and bought The Last Long Drive, the first Western I wrote. I do talks and vend at rodeos. If you write Westerns, you go where people who like Westerns are. It makes sense, doesn't it?
It does.
And so that's what that is. That's a picture of me standing next to a fella at the Great Midwestern Rodeo.
That's great. Thank you. Let's go to the next one. There's Kevin. Now, Kevin's books, Kevin is kind of a COVID author at the moment.
Yeah.
He hadn't had as many opportunities, and his books they're out within the last year and a half. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, that's correct. I don't have as much time as my fellow authors here who've got a lot more time writing books and getting out there, Karl and Dick. So yeah, a lot of the COVID kind of shut it down and didn't allow me to do some of the events. But the picture on the right there is a newscaster named Eric Kennard, and he's in San Diego, and they invited me to come on CBS Channel 8 morning show to talk about my first book, Heart of Steel. So I had an interview with them. So, and that was very exciting. So I had to make sure Eric took a photo with me before I left the studio, because I was just on cloud nine, talking about my story to the San Diego morning crew there. And I've had a lot of media with Heart of Steel and also with White Skies, Black Mingo. I talked to Alex Garrett in New York many times. We kind of developed a friendship and talked about follows up with Heart of Steel and then my new book, White Skies, Black Mingo, and discussing, Native American issues as part of that. And then I've done some interviews with other media from like WLW Cincinnati, the flagship station for the Reds. That was a good one. And I spent some time talking on Cowboy Logic Radio with Donna Fiducia, who used to be a Fox News anchor, and her husband. And they were a couple of characters. They were really fun to talk to and made the show enjoyable as well. So that's me right there. That's probably my first interview on the radio with WJER in Dover, Ohio. That's Bill Morgan right there. And he interviewed me the first time, took some pictures there. And then last month I spent some time on the Jim Masters show, Jim Masters TV. Jim Masters is, if you haven't tuned in on any of his shows, he's like the old school, like the Merv Griffins. It's a laid back, interview, and it's probably the easiest interview I've ever done. It was about 2 hours long, and it didn't seem like it, but so I got to talk about White Skies, Black Mingo on his show, and a little bit about Heart of Steel, and just talking about being an author and my experiences there. And that's on YouTube. That you can go to YouTube and catch all his shows. They're actually broadcast live to the world. So I had to kind of not think about that while we're talking. And he has just a great way of putting you at ease and just feeling like you're having a conversation one-on-one with somebody. So that's on YouTube as well. So
That's terrific. I know you've done a lot of media. You've had some print articles coming too.
Yeah, I've had dozens of print articles and radio interviews, a lot of radio interviews across the country. I have a good PR guy, Burke Allen. I'm going to throw his name down. I know you know him, Kathy. He's a good guy, not a better PR guy in the business than Mr. Burke Allen.
That's right. Burke Allen is with Allen Media Strategies, and he does PR for several of the headline authors, and he does such a good job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's move to the next one. There's Dick.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, what can I tell you? The stories are all over the place. The one with the T-shirt, be careful what you say, you could be in my next book. If I printed out 1,000 of those shirts, I could have sold them all by now. I even had a guy in Hawaii. He was carrying luggage up to his upper floor room, and his family was downstairs talking, and he was making funny faces at me, and I thought the guy might have been a little off. And then he said, no, it's your T-shirt, it's your T-shirt. So I turned back and looked at the guy and I said, well, I write horror fiction, so not all the characters make it to the end of the book, but I'll find some room for you in my story. And he dropped the luggage and it fell all the way back down the stairs. So he caught him off guard. Above that is a wonderful picture. That young lady who is in that photo was approached me about not only that book, but other books. And she came back and she didn't end up buying that book, but she bought the Miracle at Janet's Mountain book. And the reason she ended up buying that book is that her family was broken up. The father and mother had divorced, and she was going back and forth. And she asked me a question after looking at the flyleaf of the book. And she said, I'm wondering if there's a place in my life, if there's a place for God in my life. And I said, well, this book might help you in that journey. I don't know, but I said, I think you may find something in here that could be of some use to you. So she came back the following year. That's when Kill List was coming out. And she said to me, my family hasn't gotten back together, but my father takes me to church every week, which is something I was not able to do before that. And I want to thank you for helping God and helping me get back together again. So that was kind of cool, even though she ended up buying Kill List. And I hope it didn't destroy all the good work that we had done up to that point. The next one you see in the middle upper section is at a Barnes & Noble. Typical scene in Barnes & Noble, you're talking to the customers as they come through. One of the things that you see there, it's unusual, is that I'm behind the table, because I tend to like to get out in front of the table and just mingle with the customers when they come by, because the table sometimes is a barrier. And so I have a lot more success with my approach that way. And Barnes & Nobles, I've been to several of them in New England, and that's just a lot of fun for me. I enjoy meeting and greeting people. The one down below where you see all the red chairs in that area, actually, it was one of the 3 or 4 times on cruise ships where I was a guest to address the cruise members to come and meet the author and talk about my writing. And it's amazing, but I've averaged somewhere around 30 or 40 people at these events. What you don't see is the full room. You're only seeing one side of it. There were people in the middle and people on the opposite side, because in these environments, they sit where they want. Usually it's closer to the bar, but the bar was closed for the time I was there. Anyways, that's a lot of fun. And if you want to do that, you got to work out a schedule about a year ahead with the cruise line if you want to be able to do that while you're on a cruise ship. And it was a blast, because folks come up to me and talk to me after all week long. It was really a lot of fun. I can't see the whole picture of the one that's up on the right.
That is a picture of you and Don Heelan at the West Virginia Book Conference.
Oh yeah. Oh man, that was a blast. I'll tell you, it was really, really fun to be there. Kathy, you treat us like we're royalty. It's just such a wonderful experience. My wife loved West Virginia. We've got family in Kentucky, so we're down in that part of the country from time to time. I'd love to go back, and I hope this COVID thing allows that to happen, because I'd like the idea of coming down to see that holiday show that you're planning to work and setting up a schedule. I think it would be something my wife and I would both want to do.
We would love to have.
our 50th wedding anniversary this fall, so that would be cool.
Oh, great. That'd be great. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay, the next slide, that includes, hey, I happen to be an exhibitor at all places at quilt shows. And doggone it,
Bad place.
people at quilt shows, if their husbands are with them, they come migrating over because it's got nothing to do with quilts. They want somebody else to talk to. And then the ladies are constantly wandering by and stopping and looking and talking with my wife, who then ends up connecting them with me. And believe it or not, then you sell some books. So that's always a lot of fun. The middle one at the top is a little area within the state of New Hampshire Pavilion at the Big E Expo. It's a huge building. And this is when you walk in, the first counter you see is going to have yours truly and his wife set up to greet people as they come in. The picture to the far right is another opportunity to meet the author that was on a cruise ship. The one in the center in the middle is at another Barnes & Noble. The one down below at the bottom, I believe that is on the cruise ship. And then there's the newspaper story. I've had many newspaper stories covering the work that I do. I've been interviewed for audio blogs and all kinds of things that are a lot of fun. And I wished I could do more of these, but all of that was shut down over the last 15 months or so. So that's my story.
That's great. I think we're finished with the photos at this point. I know, Dick, when you were talking, I think you told us about your most memorable author event was when you met Stephen King.
Yeah.
That's pretty big.
It is, but it's also, I've met senators and governors and candidates for high office, because strangely enough, in New Hampshire, we have a reputation for being highly political. Our state motto is live free or die. I mean, who has a motto as that, right? I mean, that's just crazy. But anytime there's a gathering of 50 or more people, you can count on politicians showing up. So I've had at my booth, and I've sold books to politicians who are campaigning for high office, the presidency, or running for the Senate or running for governorship. I know a lot of these folks on a first name basis, some of which they're nice to know. Others I'd rather wished I didn't, but that's part of what you do when you're out there retailing your work. So yeah, I love it.
I think that's a nice switch that they're asking for your autograph instead of vice versa.
It is. Yeah.
Kevin, what's your most memorable author event to date?
I think probably the most memorable was being on Channel 8 morning show in San Diego for CBS. That was a thrill doing that interview. That was a lot of fun, and just all the media sitting and talking on radio stations. I mean, for a while I was, I'm out on the West Coast, so a lot of these stations were in St. Louis and Washington D.C., and I'd have to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning and shake out the sleep and get on there and talk with the morning talk radio, hosts and stuff. So that's been a big thrill for me. And then just seeing the story show up in like the Youngstown newspaper talking about the, a scandalous murder that occurred, and because Youngstown's pretty close there, and it's a big deal. I, sold a lot of books in Ohio, no coincidence there, but so I would say that being on the TV was cool.
Absolutely. Karl, what's your most memorable author event?
Kathy, sitting here and listening to these other authors, I can think they keep running through. There's a dozen, and some of them are big events, like talking to the Navy Club of Wisconsin, 150 Navy veterans in one room, listening to you talk about a Navy book you wrote, and PTSD and dealing with that, and watching the heads bob. Watching their heads bob, that struck me. Another thing was when I was first writing the first Western I wrote, The Last Long Drive, about Seabird, nowadays research, I just get on the computer and I call and I contact on the Choctaw Indian Reservation, Durant, Oklahoma, end up talking with the president of the organization, and I say, I know this is an odd name, Seabird. And he, before I could even finish the sentence, he stopped me and said, that is not an odd name. It's a traditional name. I presume you're talking about a traditional man. When somebody will grab you like that and stop you to put you on the right track, I value those things. I just treasure that. And he told me that when a Choctaw mother traditionally would give birth, she might very well give a name, a birth name, based on something she sees right there in her environment, and later on the child will take a real name, his grown name. Like Seabird's brother took the name Isaac. Seabird stayed Seabird, and probably his mother saw a bird when he was born or something. And he kept that. Just the small things. A little girl who came up to a booth at a rodeo, afraid and feeling low in herself because she was afraid of horses at a rodeo, and walked away from the booth feeling confident and courageous because of something I said to her. And it made me feel better. It made me feel more worthwhile doing something like that. Those contacts with people are the things that stick with me much more than the event. It's just these things, these individual, personal connections.
That's so true. Kevin, you have a very unusual campaign that is just starting. Would you please tell the viewers about it?
Yes, absolutely. We're going to start a campaign this week, and it's we're reaching out to the Native American community, and we're offering a free ebook for Native Americans who have received their COVID vaccination. And there is a form on the website. There's a banner on my website, authorkevinmiller.com, where Native Americans who are a member of a tribe can go up and upload it's just a shot of their COVID just to kind of validate that they received their vaccination, and we'll send them a free ebook of White Skies, Black Mingo to encourage them and try to support the Native American community that is so desperately and so devastatingly affected by this COVID virus. You know, they're probably 2 to 3 times more vulnerable to COVID than other races of people. So we're trying to reach out to them, encourage them to get the vaccination, and do all we can to encourage that, and offer them a free book if they'll do that and show their proof of that. So we're getting started this week with our buddy Burke Allen, whose grand idea that was, and I think it's a wonderful idea, and we just all jumped on board and said, absolutely, we have to do this. We need to do this. So we're going to blast that out to the Native American media and everywhere we can go to get the word out on that.
That's wonderful. And you said people can contact you through your website. Would you like to give us that address again?
Yes, the website is authorkevinmiller.com. Just authorkevinmiller.com. And the information is up there. There's a banner, rotating banner at the top. There's a static banner. You can click on that and get the form and get more information. And you can contact me. My email's up there, my social media's up there, and I love hearing from readers and folks out there. Just feel free to contact me as well if you have questions.
Thank you. Dick, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch with me through my website, and there's email addresses available there as well. And of course, they can through you as the publisher. That's always a great way to connect with authors. And I certainly look forward to the opportunities not only to speak with them one-on-one, but even to show up at events and speak to groups. It doesn't matter where, when, or how, because I just enjoy meeting people.
Thank you. Karl, how can people get in touch with you?
Probably the quickest would be email. There's my website, karlstewart.net. That's as simple as it can be, except make sure you spell with a K. There is another Karl Stewart, but I found that out, but it's not my website. karlstewart.net. Also email me at kcstewart71 at centurytel.net. That's one, but the quicker one, the shorter one, is Karl Stewart author at gmail.com. Karl Stewart author at gmail.com.
Thank you. And for those of you watching, these fine authors and all of the headline authors would love to come and do a virtual or in-person visit with your book club. If you contact me through the Headline Books website, I have a book club discount. You can get your books and then follow up with a virtual author visit. They do library presentations, school visits, including high school, college, and universities. There's a lot of places to sell books that don't involve a bookstore. Karl, you can catch up with Karl at rodeos. Kevin's going to be on the road at Native American events, and you can catch Dick on a cruise ship. I mean, you can't get more versatile than that. I think it's wonderful. We want to thank everyone for joining us on Facebook today. You can continue to put your comments in. We'll check back on that. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. This video, along with our other Zoom into Books videos, will be on the YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And if you missed the first part of this video, it will be available on the Zoom into Books and the Headline Books Facebook pages. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will see you soon.